thank you. And we had a wonderful time yesterday, and I really loved the Q&A time. The questions we asked were just phenomenal. And we do take questions on Facebook as well as X. So if 2 weeks from now you think of a great question, feel free to contact us. Well, I was raised about a 7-hour drive north of here in Vancouver, British Columbia. No one in my family was a Christian. There were no Christians in our neighborhood. But when I was 7 years of age, our school teacher took us on a field trip to the Vancouver Public Library, which at that time had 3.5 million volumes. And as a little boy, I was just stunned by all the books. I remember asking the librarian, "How many can I check out?" And she said, "You're allowed 5 per week." So I brought home 5 books on physics and astronomy, and every Saturday I would get another 5 books on physics and astronomy. Yeah, I was one of those nerdy kids. And at age 8, I told my parents, I want to become an astrophysicist. And I remember my dad saying, "Do you know how little money astrophysicists make?" And I said, "Yeah, I checked it out last year. They made an average of $6,050 per annum." And my dad said, "Well, if you studied it to that degree, you got my blessing." And every year, I would study a different subdiscipline of astrophysics. One year, it was stellar atmospheres. Another year, I was looking at the interior structure of galaxies. But when I was 16, I spent a whole year studying cosmology. That's the science of the origin and history of the universe. And at that time, there was a big debate going on amongst astronomers. Are we living in a steady-state universe, an oscillating universe, a hesitating universe, or is it Big Bang? But even at that time, the evidence was heavily favoring Big Bang. And if it's Big Bang, that means the universe has a beginning. If the universe has a beginning, there must be a cosmic beginner. So as at age 17, I went on a quest to find that cosmic beginner. Really didn't know where to look. I started reading the great philosophers, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, realized that wasn't going anywhere. Then began to look at Hinduism, Buddhism. Finally, I picked up a Bible and began to go through it. And after 2 years study of that Bible, realized this is from the one that created the universe, and I gave my life to Christ. In fact, I know the exact minute when I signed my name in the back of a Gideon Bible, giving my life to Jesus Christ. And we have stories. Well, thank you. And I'm not alone. I know a number of astronomers have a similar story of, basically going through the Bible very carefully and dedicating their life to Christ. We still have some copies of this book, A Testable Faith, out there at the table. So if you didn't get one yesterday, you can scan that QR code, and they'll give you a free copy of this book, Testable Faith, where we kind of review how science links to the Christian faith, how the more we learn about science, the stronger case we get for the Christian faith. And I've been asked this morning to look at the latest scientific evidence pointing to God. And when we launched Reasons to Believe 40 years ago, the church where I serve on the pastoral staff said, "Hugh, how often does a major paper get published that gives us more evidence for the Christian faith?" And I said, "Well, it's several per day." And they said, "Well, in that case, we need to help you launch an organization." That was the birth of Reasons to Believe. But part of my story is that I was reading the Bible in my late teenage years at the same time that physicists in South Africa and Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And today we have over 30 of these space-time theorems. And the most potent of these theorems says the following, that any universe that expands has a space-time beginning, which proves there must be a causal agent outside of space and time who creates space-time, matter, and energy. And when I was kind of looking at that in my late teenage years, realizing, and all these books I've been looking at, the Eastern religions teach that space and time are eternal. The Bible teaches that God created space and time. And now we get theorems that prove that the Eastern religions got it wrong, but the Bible got it right. Now, an agnostic astronomer who had a big role in developing these space-time theorems, Alexander Vilenkin, he wrote this in a book. He said, quote, "With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. And the problem is, a God beyond space and time must have created this universe of matter, energy, space, and time. Now, it is true that physicists had developed models of the universe that didn't require this causal agent, but every one of those models was a universe where the universe was not expanding. Only an expanding universe permits the existence of life. So the very fact that you're sitting here in the pews is proof there must be a God beyond space and time that created our universe. What bigger miracle of creation could any scientist hope to find than a miracle of bringing the entire universe into existence? And it tells us in multiple places that heavens declare the glory of God. As I read those passages, it's like the heavens scream the glory of God. They're shouting the glory of God. Every part of the universe we examine screams that it's been created by this causal agent. That's true of the galaxy that we live in. It's true of the galaxy cluster, the cosmic web. It's especially true of our star. And what's been happening over the past 70 years is astronomers have been on a quest to find a twin of the sun. And they found many stars that are twins of one another, but they've yet to find a star sufficiently like the sun that it could be a candidate to have a planet orbiting it in which advanced life exists. Now, what makes advanced life possible on our planet, we happen to be orbiting a star that's very stable in its luminosity. Its brightness variations are way below 0.1% over a century, incredibly stable. And as we looked at these tens of millions of stars that we can investigate in our Milky Way galaxy, all of them are way more unstable than our star, the sun. In fact, what you see in this graph here, the top line shows you the luminosity stability of our sun. The bottom line shows us the second best star we've ever found. And that second best star, the luminosity is so unstable, there's no way you could have an advanced species with advanced civilization. We're literally orbiting the only star where that is possible. We're also orbiting that star at the only time where it's possible. One thing we've learned about stars, they're kind of like human beings. They're unstable when they're young, they're unstable when they're old. They're maximally stable when they're middle-aged. Now, in the case of us human beings, our stability period is most of our lifespan. That's not true of stars. For stars, their period of optimal stability is extremely narrow in their lifespan. And we happen to be orbiting the sun at that very moment when it is extremely stable in our luminosity. So yes, when our family celebrates Thanksgiving, we thank God for putting us here on planet Earth at the moment when the sun happened to be most stable and where the sun is the most stable of all stars that exist. Well, God's revealing himself not just through astrophysics. He's revealing himself literally through every scientific discipline. So let me switch gears to something my colleague Fuzz Rana touched on yesterday in our conference, and that is the fact that we human beings are unlike any other primate that has ever existed, whether primates that are on the planet today or things like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and Homo erectus. And where we really differ is our head. The head is where we see the greatest difference. So for example, the Neanderthal has got a head that's more similar to ours than any other bipedal primate, but even so, it's radically different. The Neanderthal head, the brain is kind of like a Coke can. It's cylindrical. Notice our brain is kind of like a basketball. It's globular shape, so radically different shape. The other thing we notice is that Neanderthal has a very powerful jawbone and supports very powerful jaw muscles. We're wimps by comparison. We have this very facile jawbone and very weak jaw muscles. And we don't need strong jaw muscles because we got this brain which immediately enables us to say, hey, we can grind up the food that we're gathering, we can boil it, we can roast it, and we can be able to make it soft enough that we can eat it and get a lot of calories in a hurry. So for example, we now know that even Adam and Eve had to be preparing and cooking their food. They simply lacked the anatomy to be able to survive on raw food. Although, hey, while they're in the Garden of Eden, apparently they could just pick fruit off the tree and eat it. But once they got cast out, they had to be cooking. And we now have evidence that even the earliest humans were preparing and cooking their food. And the thing you notice about if you ever go to the zoo and watch gorillas or chimpanzees, when they're eating their food, they go off by themselves and they spend hours chewing their food. That's because they're eating raw food. Although sometimes in zoos they give them prepared food. But in the wild, they're literally spending hours a day chewing their food. And we human beings, because we're eating soft food, we can get all the calories we need quite quickly. And by the way, even though our bodies are a lot smaller than the Neanderthal bodies, we need way more calories. You want to know why? Your brain takes 35% of the energy that you consume. Our brain is very energy intensive, so we have to eat a lot in order to keep that brain going. But because of that brain, we're able to gather a lot of food very efficiently, prepare it and cook it, and get a lot of calories in a hurry. God also designed us with the anatomy that we can eat and talk at the same time. We can eat and think at the same time. I remember being at Caltech, and it's like we solved some of the most challenging problems while we're having lunch together. Eating didn't stop us from thinking. And some of the things we notice in the latest research is how radically different the human brain is from the brains of all other primates. So for example, with the Neanderthals, which come the closest to us, what we notice is the human cerebellum, that's kind of the big fleshy part you see in the brain, is larger in both hemispheres. And ours are equal, but we look at the Neanderthal, what we notice is the right side of the cerebellum is smaller than the left. The human brain is globular, Neanderthal brain is kind of like cylindrical. The parietal lobe in the human brain is way bigger. You say, what's that lobe all about? That's the lobe you use to do tensor calculus, to do philosophy, to be able to engage in theology, to listen to the pastor's sermon here and figure out what he's saying. That's your parietal lobe that's pulling all that off. And we're the only species that has a large enough parietal lobe to make that happen. Our neocortex is larger. Brand new discovery. We discovered a particular gene that explains something about our human brain that wasn't known before. Namely, that our human brain has way more complex neurons than we see in the brains of other primates. And we have a much greater neuronal density. So even though the Neanderthal brain's the same size as ours is way more neurons. And the neurons are far more complex and diverse, which enable us to do all the amazing things that we do. And we now recognize is that the Neanderthal population never exceeded 15,000 individuals, and probably never exceeded 8,000. And this is also true of the other bipedal primates. Their populations were so low, there's no way they could have evolved from one species to another species. Just like God created us human beings, specially created in the Garden of Eden, likewise, he created all the bipedal primates that preceded us. And people have wondered, if there's a God, why would he do that? Well, God knew that we human beings would fall in the garden. We would sin. And in our sin, we would begin abusing the very animals that we need for our civilization. So God in advance prepared a sequence of bipedal primates where each one was a little more efficient at hunting large-bodied bird and mammal species, basically giving these species a training where they were basically step-by-step trained. When you see tall bipedals with weapons in their hands, run away. And so what happened is the continents where these bipedal primates existed, those large-bodied bird and mammal species survived. So for example, when modern humans first went into Africa, the extinction rate was only 4%. However, when humans went into Australia, where there were no previous species of bipedal primates, the extinction rate was 94.5%. And explains why the Aborigines never got out of the Stone Age. They wiped out all the bird and mammal species they needed to launch and sustain civilization. To a lesser degree, that also happened here in North and South America. North America, the extinction rate was 73%. South America, it was 78%. And consequently, the natives here, again, were not able to get out of the Stone Age. Extinction rate in Africa, just 4%. Extinction rate in Asia was just 20%, and therefore they were able to sustain the civilization. So we now know these primates are not the product of evolution. They're the product of special creation events, with a God that knew in advance that the super predator, we human beings, who can kill any creature we want, that we would sin. And so God stepped in advance and made sure that these animals would survive in spite of our sin. But the latest science is also telling us that what's true for the primates is true for all animals on the face of the earth. And just this past Saturday, we had a workshop at Reasons to Believe, a workshop focused on what's happening on the frontiers of research of evolutionary biology. And there's literally a paradigm shift happening where even the atheists and agnostic evolutionary biologists are abandoning Charles Darwin and adopting deistic models of interpretation. Now, they don't use the word God, but they'll say things like there's some kind of agent that's working and planning things and directing the history of life in such a way that we can exist. But the naturalistic model of evolution that you've all been taught in the public education system is that life evolves through natural selection and through mutations. And we now know that there's other mechanisms, namely gene exchange. Microbes can exchange genes with one another. The higher species engage in epigenetics. So these are the four mechanisms that drive change in a theistic evolutionary model or naturalistic evolutionary model. But the thing we note about these mechanisms, they all bring about tiny changes, not big changes. But with a combination, you can get a little bit more. There's been some speculation. Is there a fifth mechanism? Because the recognition is these four are not adequate to explain the history of life. But we now know if there is a fifth mechanism, that it contributes way less than 0.1% to the changes that take place naturalistically. Now, natural selection, mutations, gene exchange, and epigenetics, they're going to bring about small changes at the species level. But if you let that run long enough, you get a new species. And people have actually seen the appearance of new species happening in the realm of nature. Interestingly, the place where we see it most frequently is the islands of the Pacific Northwest. And then you basically speculate, okay, we get these new species coming out through these mechanisms. If we wait long enough, maybe we'll get a new genus. And the proliferation of new genes will eventually, new genera will lead to new families. And if you wait even longer, the proliferation of families will bring about new orders. New orders will bring about new classes. Last of all, you're going to get the appearance of the phyla. Here's the big problem. When you look at the fossil record, we see the exact opposite of what these naturalistic and theistic evolutionary models predict. We don't see the differentiation of species first and phyla last. It's the other way around. The differentiation of phyla occurs first, and the differentiation of the species occurs last. New phyla appear first, not last, and they appear simultaneously and suddenly. The naturalistic models would say, well, if we do get a new phyla, we'll get the simple one first, then the more complex one tens of millions of years later, and a more complex one tens of millions of years later. But that's not what we see. They all show up simultaneously and suddenly. And they show up the very moment the physical and chemical conditions will permit their existence. So, for example, it's well known that our Earth's atmosphere slowly oxygenated as a result of photosynthetic bacteria in the oceans and on the land. And this is how it looks. For the first couple of billion years, the oxygen content in the atmosphere is below 0.01%. But then there's a process in the crust and the mantle of the Earth called the deep oxygen cycle. And when it operates, you get a sudden burst. And so there was a moment when the oxygen content jumped up to about 2%, but then it fell back down to below 1%, and stayed below 1% until about 600 million years ago, when it gradually moved from 1% up to 2%. But then there was a major event called the Great Unconformity, where all the continents in the world had these massive landslides, and that stimulated the deep oxygen cycle, which caused the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere to suddenly jump from 2% to 8%. Now, 8% is the minimum that you need to have animals that are bigger than microscopic size. But the moment it hit 8%, we get animals as big as 2 meters across. Now, because it's only 8%, these are filter feeders, or like the sponges. They don't have a digestive tract, but they do have large body sizes. And it's not just one phylum of these filter feeders that shows up. The 3 phyla all show up simultaneously at the beginning of the Avalon explosion 575 million years ago. And they proliferate on the face of the Earth. But then there's another geological event that causes them to go extinct and drives the oxygen from 8% up to 10%. But the moment it hit 10%, you get the Cambrian explosion of life. At 10%, you can now have animals with a digestive tract, a circulatory system, a heart, and a brain, internal organs and external organs. And we notice with the Cambrian explosion, at the very beginning of the Cambrian event, you get every eye design that exists on the planet today. You get all the internal organs that we see in the planet today showing up not at the end of the Cambrian explosion, but at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. We see a proliferation of 30 phyla. All 30 phyla happen simultaneously and suddenly and immediately when the oxygen hits 10%. The old thinking was, well, we're going to get the simplest phyla first, and 50 million years later, we'll get the most complex phylum, the one that we're all part of. We're all chordates. Chordates are animals that have a long neural cord that runs along the part of their body. All vertebrates are chordates, but also there's a number of invertebrates that are chordates. Well, the thinking was, okay, we're going to get the invertebrates first, and we're going to get the vertebrates last of all. But a discovery in China a few years ago demonstrated there are vertebrates at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. All the phyla show up at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And we now realize it's probably all the phyla that exist on the planet today exist at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. A year ago, the thinking was, well, we found 27 of the 30 that are on the planet today. The 3 must have happened later, but they just added number 28 to the list. And the reason why is we're talking very tiny animals that are no bigger than a millimeter across. They're hard to find in the fossil record, but a study in Australia discovered that, hey, the bryozoa are also there at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. I'm on record as predicting we're going to find all 30 at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. But this has caused a whole change of conclusions in the scientific literature in paleontology. Led by James Valentine and his team. James Valentine is a very famous paleontologist, an atheist by perspective, but this is what he and his team wrote about the Cambrian explosion. He says the diversification of phyla occurs before that of classes, classes before that of orders, and orders before that of families. And the emphasis is in his paper. And he basically was concluding this is the exact opposite of what we would expect. We'd expect the species to occur first, but the species diversification occurs last. Now, he didn't put this in his paper, but we put it in articles that are up on our reasons.org website, that these observations contradict what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective or a theistic evolutionary perspective, but they're exactly what you'd expect that are driven by a creator intent on preparing the planet as rapidly as possible for us human beings. And people joke with me and saying, hey, you're claiming life has been here for 3.8 billion years? I said, that's extremely aggressive. To get humans on the scene in just 3.8 billion years after the first bacteria, the creator has to be very aggressively creating life on the planet of Earth to get everything happening that fast. Keep in mind, I'm an astrophysicist. Billions of years is like a few seconds, right? So, but it is extremely aggressive. And these observations we're seeing of the phyla first, of them showing up suddenly and immediately once chemical conditions permit them, this fits the actions of a supernatural creator who is intent on perfectly compensating for the increasing brightness of the sun so that life can remain on planet Earth in superabundance and super diversity, something you see in all 6 creation psalms, that God packs our planet with as much life as possible and as diverse as possible. But this requires this aggressive, immediate interventions throughout the history of life. Now, I notice here that I mentioned the sun. I've done a lot of debates with evolutionary biologists, and typically they're expecting, hey, we're going to be talking about paleontology, we're going to be talking about genetics, we're going to be talking about changes in the environment. But in all those debates, they say, have you considered the physics of the sun? And the response is, what on earth does the sun have to do with the history of life on planet Earth? The answer is everything. The problem is evolutionary biologists assume that the sun has been steady and constant in the brightness that it reveals. That's not at all the case. The sun gets progressively brighter and brighter as it continues to fuse hydrogen into helium in its nuclear furnace. Our sun is a gigantic hydrogen bomb, taking hydrogen and fusing it into helium. But the more helium it produces, the more efficient the nuclear furnace in the center of our sun becomes. So the sun today is 23% brighter than it was when God created the first life. The problem is life can only tolerate a 1% change in the brightness of the sun before all life goes extinct. So how do you deal with that? Well, what we notice is certain life forms are more efficient at pulling carbon dioxide and methane out of the atmosphere. Those are greenhouse gases. And when God created the first life on planet Earth, there was about 50,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Today there's 400? And what's been happening over the history of our planet is different life forms have been pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And by the way, they've been transforming them into very useful products we need for human civilization. This has been going on for the past 3.8 billion years. But here's the problem. Only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which life to pull away from planet Earth and which new life to create, where that new life is a little more efficient at pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So as the sun is getting progressively brighter and brighter, the greenhouse gases are becoming less and less efficient in trapping the heat of the sun, keeping the temperature and the surface of the Earth throughout that whole time optimal for the maximum abundance of life and the maximum diversity of life. Only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which life to remove, which new life to create, and how frequently to do that. Now, knowing the physics of the sun, we know that the Creator would need to intervene about once every 30 to 35 million years. When you look at the fossil record, that's exactly what you see. We get a mass extinction event about every 30 to 35 million years, where anywhere from 30 to 95% of the species of life on planet Earth is driven to extinction. But with every mass extinction event, very soon thereafter, you get a mass speciation event. Millions of new species suddenly appear simultaneously in the face of the Earth, where those millions of new species are a little more efficient at pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere to keep the temperature on the surface of the Earth exactly optimal for life. Now, the Bible said it first. It's in the longest of the creation Psalms, Psalm 104. They die and return to the dust, referring to life on planet Earth. When you send your spirit, referring to God, they are created and you renew the face of the earth. Now, what's interesting about this psalm, and you see this in the creation psalms, it's referring to the non-human life on planet Earth, but there's also an application for us human beings. Just like God brings death to these non-human creatures and then brings new life, he's intent on doing the same thing to every human being. The gospel message is built right into the very end of Psalm 104. God's intent is that we would realize, hey, I'm arrogant, I'm trying to run my own life, but when I run my own life, I mess things up. That needs to die. And there's a God out there that's prepared to give us new life if we're willing to die it ourselves. So the resurrection is built right in here to Psalm 104. That God is prepared to do the same thing for every human being that he's done for life on our planet for the past 3.8 billion years. But the difference is God lets us choose. He waits for us to say, hey, I realize that you know better than I do what's best for my life. I'm going to die to self and let you transform me and give me new life. And when God does that, it's an eternal transformation. When God sends the Holy Spirit into the lives of new believers, they become new creatures in Christ. They're totally renewed. They're eternally renewed. The more we learn about nature, the more evidence we gain for the supernatural handiwork of God and God's plan to redeem billions of human beings unto himself. Thank you.